one of the arguments that we saw last week is that the way that Jewish tradition processes history is via memory. And what that means is that when Jewish tradition, when Jews, when Jewish texts, when Jewish holidays, whatever we want to call it, whenever Jewish tradition asks us to look back in time, it's almost always to try to get us to do something in the present or something forward-looking. So the most explicit example that we'll even come back to a little bit today, because it's sort of the central story of Jewish memory, is the Exodus from Egypt, which we talked about a little bit last week. But ironically, if you had to classify the Seder using two descriptions, right? The yearly Passover Seder, where we retell the story of the Exodus, it's all about a story that happened a very long time ago. And the reason why we're talking about it is to teach the next generation that the story happened. And it's not just making sure the next generation knows, oh, a long time ago, there was a story. There's actually some Jewish, there's some ethical, some universal, some particular imperatives that actually come alongside with that memory. And so I'm going to share my screen. I'll also share our text sheet for today in here if people would rather follow along there. And just to start us off with this quote that we had again from last week, all the way at the top here. Perfect. From Yosef Yerushalmi, who's one of the most widely quoted Jewish historians of the 20th century, where he has this very famous idea that the antonym of forgetting is not remembering, but justice. And what that means is that in Jewish tradition, the reason why we're so obsessed with memory, and if you actually read through the words zachor, yizkor, tizkor, right, some root of the word memory in the Tanakh, it's hundreds of times. I mean, the Torah is obsessed with us remembering things. And his entire argument is that we are not a tradition that's stuck in the past, right? I think if there's one thing that we can argue about a bird's eye view of Jewish history, is that Jewish tradition is very forward-looking, right? We're always thinking about how can we better the world for good? We're always thinking about where do we want to be tomorrow, right? Jewish tradition is quite obsessed with the next generation, right? We talk about this in so many of our texts, right? Dor la dor, right? What are we going to do to make sure that the Jewish future is going to be strong? And ironically, the way that we do that is actually by focusing in the past. And so what we talked about last time, again, this is all just a little bit of a summary, is that one of the reasons why Jewish history should be studied is not only because it's really interesting what happened over the last 4,000 years in our tradition, although that is really interesting, it shines light on current present day situations and allows us to figure out, okay, the Jewish community has been at crossroads before. Okay, we've had times in history where nobody could agree on politics. Okay, we've had times in history where we needed to make major innovations in terms of how we practice Judaism. And through learning all of that, when new situations arise, we're a lot less likely to say, oh my goodness, this is a crisis. We've never seen something like this before, but actually look back at, well, hey, I'll just pick one example. In the 1st century BCE, right as Jerusalem as the center of the Jewish world, we'll talk about this probably in 2 or 3 weeks, was about to collapse, there were about 4 or 5 different sectarian Jewish groups that had such strong disagreements in terms of the politics of what was going on. Do we make peace with the Roman Empire? Do we continuously fight the Roman Empire? Should we try to, pivot and move somewhere else? That there was actually acts of Jewish sabotage for other groups. And by that, I mean, I'm speaking nicely. Josephus, who is the dominant historian of the 1st century CE, notes that there were actually Jewish groups that had such strong political opinions, they would go around to other synagogues and basically use physical force to stoke fear. And so all that's a long-winded interpretation to say through studying of history, and I think this goes beyond Judaism, just as a general study of history, but I'll keep it to Judaism. With here, our study of history is not backwards looking. A lot of times it's present looking and actually forward looking. With that said, so that was a lot of last week. We're going to try to cover about 600 years today. So we'll see how that goes. And again, in a 10-week course to go through 4,000 years, we have to cover multi-hundred trunks at a time. So I wanted to start off with a series of verses from Deuteronomy, Devarim, the 5th book of the Torah, because one of the things that we discussed last week is we started with Abraham. We then counted down Abraham's lineage, right? Abraham and Sarah had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. Jacob he has this mythical moment where he turns into the people of Israel. And then I think at this point, most of us are familiar with at least the general story, right? The Israelites go down to Egypt, and eventually there's an exodus from Egypt that takes place. And this is described in the first half of the book of Exodus. And so again, just in terms of my methodology, I'm far less interested in teaching bullet point history, because I think anybody here can Google what year did X happen, right? This is far more about unpacking the ideas of history. So this is really, it is a study of history, but through ideas, discussions, debates, right? What was happening at the time, just like, if we can imagine, I'll say this, and hopefully this doesn't spiral into a completely other conversation, but at risk of this happening, right? If one was trying to tell a history of America in 2022 about the election, it would be far less interesting to analyze that history if somebody said, on this date, this happened, on this date, this happened, on this date, this was happening. Whereas, as opposed to them pointing a broader picture of, here's what was going on in society at the time. Here, we had these multiple groups. This is generally what the tensions were. And then maybe throw in a couple of dates, and then, blah, blah, blah happened on this date, right? So that's basically our methodology for studying Jewish history. Okay. So Deuteronomy is painting up, so I'm going to read it and then I'll explain the background. So Moses, right, this is in Moses's last speech, right before the Israelites are about to cross over into the new land, into the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, and establish their nation. And he says quite simply, when you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage and you possess it and settle it, right? So he says, once all that hard work is done, right? Once you're in the land of Israel, right? You don't have to worry about, tribal wars happening. You don't have to worry about building up establishments and institutions. What should you do? You should take some of every first fruit of the soil, which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You should put it in a basket, and you should go to the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name, right? So we're learning a couple things about ancient Israelite society here, right? One, we're learning this was a predominantly agrarian society, which means the agricultural cycle was how a lot of rituals in the Torah are described through what was happening in the agricultural cycle. It would be very similar to if, somebody was writing a modern day book of ethics, and a lot of it was talking about the need to be ethical with stock trading and taxes and everything like that, because that's, again, what we're used to dealing with on a daily basis. So a lot of things in the Torah are shining through the wider agrarian cycle, right? So what does Moses say you should do? Once you've done all of your hard work, you've cultivated your fields, you have your first fruits, bring it in a basket and go to the place where God will choose to establish his name. That's almost always, when the Torah uses that, a reference to Jerusalem. Then it says, you shall go to the Kohen, the priest who's in charge at that time, and say to him, I acknowledge this day before the Lord your God that I have entered this land that the Lord swore to our fathers to assign us. The priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down in front of the altar of the Lord your God. And then you should recite as follows before the Lord your God. My father was a fugitive, a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a very great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm, an awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us to this land and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. I'm hoping at this point that at least for a good amount of you, everybody sort of has an alarm bell going off in terms of where we know this text from, because this, of course, is taken by the rabbis in the Talmudic period, and they actually build the entire Passover Haggadah around these verses. So if we remember to our Passover Haggadah, the entire thing is actually a commentary on these 4 or 5 verses. But this, at this point in Jewish history, we're already being given, and this gets back into a little bit of memory, right? This is the important thing to remember, right? Moses is saying, once you're well established in Israel, once you have a commonwealth, once you have institutions such as the temple, which, by the way, weren't going to be built for another 400 years, just remember your background, right? Don't become so cocky, right? In a sense, this is what Moses' message is. Don't become so haughty and so cocky that you're getting to the point where you're thinking, we have everything we need, right? The fruits are ours, right? This land is ours, right? We've always sort of been at the pinnacle of society, specifically at that time when you think things are going pretty well societally, right? Right when you go to reap your harvest, right? That's the moment when you actually have to remember this past. And remember that actually you weren't the reasons why you're here. I think the internet connection is a little bit laggy, so I apologize if I was a little laggy up to this point, right? Because this sort of takes us through everything we did last week. Do we have any questions or any thoughts here about sort of how this history then turns into a memory that has to be constantly relived? I'll take 2 minutes for questions here.
Well, I think if you're gonna, when your first fruits, is it the first fruits of every season? So if it is, then you're gonna remember this every season. It's not just something you do the first time that you bring fruits to the, the place where God has, choose to establish his name.
100%, and that's a great comment, and I think that highlights the importance. Again, our tradition becomes, I mean, it's hard to overemphasize how central the Exodus is to Jewish traditional life. I mean, what I mean by that is virtually, I think we talked about this a little bit last week, it is almost impossible to do anything Jewish in a traditional setting where the Exodus is not brought up at least once or twice, right? Every time we say Shema, every time we make Kiddush on Shabbat, every time we say the Shemona Esrei, anytime we celebrate the Jewish calendar, every time there's, any special prayers, right? The Exodus just becomes central, right? Same with Tanakh, right? It was central for the agrarian cycle. And even today, I mean, the Exodus has basically made its way into almost every single Jewish function one could imagine. I mean, it's quite impressive because the dominant message of the Exodus here, seen through a historical perspective, is there's going to be at least a couple 100-year period, which we're going to talk about today, where things were really great for the ancient Israelite kingdom, right? There was money, there was resources, they had a strong army, there was a nice big temple that had, tons of money behind it. There was a castle that David and Solomon had, right? You have every reason to think, just like, let's say, the surrounding nations, meaning the ancient world, right? We know this both from the Tanakh and also from other sources. The ancient world was full of ancient empires who, in their conquering of the Middle East and the ancient world in general, when they won wars, they made the assumption that, well, it's because either God likes us better, right? We're more important, we're more special. Maybe even the leader of that nation is God, right? Pharaoh saw himself as God. Sancheiriv, the head of the Assyrian Empire, saw himself as God. Babylonian leaders saw themselves as God, right? The Torah is very worried that once things are great and institutions are flourishing, that the leaders of said institutions and the country are going to see themselves as God, right? Maybe not literally God, but think, I can do whatever I want now. I have all the power. And one of the things we're actually going to talk about is this tension about power that we see all throughout Tanakh, right? That'll be one of the main ideas today, but just starting it off with, again, rooting us in this very humble history of, no, actually remember where you came from, right? You were once slaves in Egypt. Things weren't going so well. You needed an outside force to help you, right? Don't think that everything you've earned was through your own hands, right? Hopefully that instills some sort of humility to think when things are going well, one, to realize they might not have always gone well. And when you see others that are in need of help, you think, well, listen, there was one time where we needed help. Therefore, we have to almost pay the favor forward, right? There's an ethical imperative in terms of helping people that are at the lower point of society, right? And this idea just being constantly drilled. So, okay, so we have this idea that Moses, this is one of the last ideas that Moshe is trying to instill in the ancient Israelites. So now let's get into a little bit of actual history, and these sort of, maybe we'll read a little bit more like bullet points, but just painting the picture of what's happening. So after the 5 books of Moses, after the Torah, the next book right after is called Yehoshua or Joshua. Joshua is the successor of Moshe, and we actually, we know a little bit about Joshua just from various stories in the Torah about him, but we don't know a ton about him. Right? We don't know nearly as much about him as we know about Moses. And Joshua just ends up being basically the character who finishes Moshe's legacy. right? And one of the things that we're going to see with Joshua, and again, sadly, we don't have time to spend an entire class on every book in the Tanakh because there's 24 of them and there's only 10 weeks here and we have far more than just the Tanakh to cover. But Joshua really is constantly in almost the shadows of Moses, right? If you read through the book of Joshua, it honestly reads like a series of ancient war stories, right? The entire purpose of the book of Joshua is a couplefold. One, it's the story of when we actually do enter into the land of Israel. It's the story of the subsequent conquering of the land of Israel, the presumable eradication of the inhabitants of the land of Israel. This is, by the way, I think from a purely literary perspective, the book of Joshua, I think, is one of the toughest books from a general ethical perspective, right? The book of Joshua has actually troubled Jewish thinkers, right, far before the Enlightenment, right? The rabbis in the Midrash and the Talmud, right, 2nd to 5th century CE, Maimonides, the 12th century scholar, they were really, I'm trying to think of the right word. They were very weary of the story of Joshua because, again, if anybody has time, right, the book of Joshua is quite literally, they marched to the city of Jericho, they surrounded the city of Jericho, the walls fell and they killed everybody. They then marched to the city of Ai, they surrounded the city, right, everybody was killed. And so, again, just to sort of get a little glimpse into how Jewish tradition handles tricky moral situations, and we can talk about this later on in the rabbinic and medieval period, is one, Jewish thinkers were not afraid to address these questions head on, right? They were not afraid to basically say, oh, don't worry about it, right? It is what it is. I think more importantly, Jewish thinkers also did not give the sort of stereotypical or obvious religious argument, which is, well, God commanded it, it must have been moral, right? That's not what medieval Jewish thinkers and even the rabbis of the Midrash taught, right? They were desperately, and again, we can rate their interpretations on a scale from 1 to 10 of believability, but the rabbis in the Talmud, the medieval thinkers were desperate to try to figure out how can such a book exist? Because again, the stories are quite gruesome, right? And this isn't, again, just, friendly, war skirmishes. I mean, really, some of the stuff there would probably make anybody with modern sensibilities, shake a little bit. I actually did an interesting, this is sort of my self-devised psychology experiment that I did a couple years ago on some unsuspecting students at UCI, where I wanted to talk about this idea of, ethically problematic stories in our tradition. But I knew that if I brought them, some of the stories from Joshua, a lot of them would immediately feel uncomfortable. So what I did, right, we can judge the ethics of what I did at a separate time. I went through and I changed the names of the book to other names. And I told them that this was some ancient, Babylonian story of them conquering Babylonia. And I asked them to rate the ethics of these stories. And they said, this is really problematic. And then at the end, I said, well, this is actually the Tanakh, right? How would you answer this question from a Jewish traditional point of view? It was an interesting thought experiment. But one of the things that we actually see with the rabbis and the medieval thinkers is there was a need to explain this. And so one of the ways in which this is explained, and this is, sort of the Jewish traditional answer, is it's not that there were nations in the land that because God promised Israel to the Israelites, these nations just had to go, and the only way was all-out warfare, right? The way that the rabbis and the way that the medieval thinkers depict these tribes, and again, this isn't my argument, this is, what we see in Jewish tradition, is that the wider society that these tribes were cultivating, specifically around child sacrifice, was so nefarious that the only thing to do was to basically wipe out these societies, right? This is the argument that Maimonides makes, right? There's other thinkers. But all that's to say, right, I don't want to get into a whole conversation about, medieval Jewish philosophic debates here, but a lot of the stories in the early Tanakh, right, have been seen as troubling for later Jewish thinkers. And actually pointing out the troubling nature of a lot of these stories does not put us outside of Jewish tradition. It actually puts us right in the middle. And so any trouble we might have with any stories in the Tanakh or the Torah, we are probably not the first generation of Jews to be sitting around saying, how can this be? Ruth, go for it.
How about Purim? The story of Purim, where after Haman is killed, the Jews go on a rampage and kill, the Persians. Same thing with Hanukkah. I mean, I always call the Maccabees the Taliban. They went and they weren't even really a priestly, priestly family. So I think that there are other places too where thinkers would have problems with it.
Yeah, 100%. And just one note on Hanukkah, because I actually think it goes well with this wider theme of how Jewish tradition handles this. Hanukkah is an incredible story. I mean, we'll probably have 10, 15 minutes in a couple of weeks to go through Hanukkah. Hanukkah is really incredible in terms of how Jewish tradition handled it, because Ruth is 100% right. The actual history of Hanukkah is a pretty bad story. I mean, you have a radical sect of, bandits basically coming in and not killing the Greeks as we had been taught when we were maybe little, but actually killing other Jews who were becoming more and more assimilated. And, this was, you can read historic documents, right? We also have the book of Maccabees that was preserved, right? Obviously not in the Tanakh, but it was preserved in sort of general Second Temple literature. And the rabbis took this story. The rabbis were afraid of people using this story as inspiration for the same type of violence. They knew they couldn't rid us of this story altogether, although they tried, right? One of the chief hints that scholars point to is that the Mishnah, right, so the first half of the Talmud actually has a tractate dealing with basically every major Jewish holiday, and they leave Hanukkah out, right? So the early rabbis basically tried to do away with Hanukkah, and once they realized they couldn't, they focused on, one of the only redeeming factors of the story, which was the miracle of the lights, and tried to make the holiday all about increasing light into the world and openness. And, it's incredible because it was inverted 180 in terms of the idea behind the story. But all that's to say, just to sort of get us back here in history, Jewish tradition, again, the way we relate to history, I'm going to sound like a broken record for a second, but I think that's actually a really interesting example. The way that we relate to history is not, let's try to figure out exactly what happened and recreate it, right? Very few Jewish thinkers have ever wanted that, right? It's, let's interpret what happened. Sometimes our interpretation might contradict the original story, and who cares, right? I'm giving the argument from Jewish tradition point of view, right? If we say that the point of Hanukkah is the miracle of the lights and increasing light into the world and giving, at least how it iterated in America, right? Giving gifts and public candle lightings and basically an all around time of warmth. Don't tell me, right? I'm just giving the, other side, right? And somebody comes and tells me, what you're actually celebrating is, this terrible story of, all this violence, right? To some extent, the Jewish traditional answer is, no, I'm not, right? You're thinking of a different holiday. You're thinking of what actually happened historically. I'm talking about how Jewish tradition has remembered Hanukkah, right? And it's similar with a lot of these texts. So just moving on a little bit, right? So that's the book of Joshua, right? Just with a little bit of a commentary on it. The book right after Joshua is a book called Shoftim, and this is the period of the judges, and this gets us a little closer to the wider conversation I wanted to have today. And again, just on a timeline schedule, this is the period from about 1400 BCE to 1200 BCE, right? And just to go back to this timeline that we had before, right? Moses and the Exodus are in where my mouse is about 1400 BCE, and 1000 is when we get King David. And right now we are in the inter period between entering into the land of Israel and King David, right? So this is all of what happened in there, trying to figure out, right? And this took 400 years, right? So trying to figure out, how do we actually create this society that the Torah wants us to create, right? And again, this did not happen overnight. The main point of the book of Judges, right? And the book of Judges, again, fascinating stories, right? The book of Judges actually reads like almost a series of short stories, because you have about 15 different stories, maybe a little fewer, maybe 12 to 13 different stories that seemingly have nothing to do with each other, right? So it's not obvious, what the wider historical connection between all these people are. And there are different, quite literally, judges, but we can almost think of them as heroes that arise, and they each help move the Israelite community past some tragedy, right? Probably the most famous of the judges is Samson, right? The man who went to battle with the Philistines and he was a Nazarite. So at the end of his life, right, his hair was cut and he basically took down a Philistine temple, basically committing, a mass suicide, right? If we're not familiar with the story of Samson, and, I don't want that to derail us too much, but a lot of stories like that, which highlight two things. One, there was just utter chaos everywhere, right? One of the things you immediately note from the book of Judges is almost this meta question of who's in charge, right? Who's governing Israelite society? Because you get these different judges that arise. Some of them are good, some of them are neutral, some of them even have a little bit of negative to them, right? Samson in Jewish literature is not depicted as a great guy, right? The Tanakh and the stories about Samson, right, are not overly flattering, right? He's depicted sort of as a easily angered goofball who basically is lusting after women, which ends up being his downfall, right? So that's right. So these judges are not a long-term sustainable leadership. And if you read through the book of Judges, the idea that continuously comes out, and this is going to get important because it gets into our next debate, is this verse, which probably appears in the book of Judges 20 times, right? It's in those days, there was no king in Israel and everybody did what was right in their own eyes, right? This constant message of basically saying this was a situation of utter chaos. There was nobody in charge, right? This was full on anarchy. And this was not a sustainable way to run a society.
Yeah, I'm watching that.
And this actually gets really interesting, just to show a map and then give a little bit of commentary. So this is the map of what life would have looked like in ancient Israel from 1200 to 1000, where you have the different 12 tribes that are scattered around throughout the land of Israel and also the Transjordan, right? This is modern day Jordan, where Gad and Reuben and some of Manasseh were. And basically you had a bunch of disparate tribes that were growing further and further apart. And at times the book of Judges actually depicts wars breaking out between these different tribes, right? Most famously is at the end, the tribe of Benjamin is basically put through an entire war and almost completely eradicated by the other nations. But this was not a sustainable solution. And this gets into, again, we're talking about history here, but we're also a little bit talking about philosophy to some extent, because all of a sudden you run into a problem. The problem is, to some extent, one of the core ideas of the Torah and the core ideas of this new society that we were trying to create here is this idea of eradicating political hierarchy to some extent. Like, sure, you had Moses and Joshua, but they were depicted as prophets or maybe war leaders, right? Very pragmatic, right? Obviously, you need somebody that can help teach you what to do, right? You need somebody that can practically lead you to war, but actually establishing political hierarchies, there was a very big risk of, you're looking around, right? You have Egypt in the south, you have Assyria in the north, you have Babylonia in the east, and you see all of these ancient kingdoms, basically some sort of tyrannical authoritarian countries. I'm using a little bit of modern day words, but I think it holds for history. And this was a real problem, right? What happens when a lack of political hierarchy creates chaos, but you also know that political hierarchy basically is definitely going to breed corruption. And the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy, and the books of Tanakh are no stranger to this, right? This is, I think, one of the most interesting political debates that overshadows the early part of Israelite history that we're going to run into today, which is you're caught between two things that are not favorable, right? You don't want anarchy because it doesn't work, but you're also weary of political hierarchical leadership because it's always corrupted and it always turns into a power grab, right? Again, note that a lot of times when we study history, right, this isn't just talking about something that happened once 3,000 years ago, right? Similar parallels of questions like this, happen today all over the world. So here's what ends up happening, right? So I want to read one or two stories, and then I want to have a little discussion about this, because this is at least our main question for the beginning of today. And then, if we have a little bit more time, we can go on to what I was planning on doing for next week. So just to fill in a little bit of the gap, so the period of the Judges ends with us being introduced to a man named Shmuel, or Samuel, who then becomes the name of the next book in the Tanakh. So again, for those that are counting, we have the 5 books of Moses, we then have the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, and then afterwards now we're introduced to the book of Samuel. And Samuel was depicted as a good judge, right? So he was one of the good guys. And he actually, had a very nice career, right? He was depicted in the book of Samuel, the early book of Samuel, as traveling around to all of these different tribes, basically trying to make an argument of unity and telling people, hey, your neighbors aren't so bad, right? Basically, he was a great unifier. But what happened after he passed away? So it says when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel leaders, right? So he does what a lot of leaders in history had done, right? You grow old, you can't go down anymore. Okay, I'll give the business, I'll give the title, I'll give the governance to my children. The name of his firstborn son was Joel. The name of his second was Avadia, and they served at Beersheba, right? Beersheba is right now, modern day in the Negev, right? It's right here, right? I'll scroll down a little bit here, right? Towards the south of Israel, right? Still a modern day city, right? But what happened? His sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all of a sudden, right, you come into a problem, right? Samuel was a great guy. He passes away. The next generation is becoming corrupt, right? And so this seemingly is untenable. So what happens? All of the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, you are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have, right? So again, right, hopefully by now we start to have some, red flags come up, because the leaders are basically saying, our current political situation is not working. Let's try to copy other nations. Now we know both from the Tanakh, right, the Hebrew Bible, and also other documents from this time, right, 3,200 years ago, all the other nations were pretty terrible in terms of how they governed and how they leadered and the relationship between the top of the political hierarchy and your average citizens. And they're specifically noting, by the way, and this is something that is going to become at play later, they're specifically saying, we want to be like the other nations, right? Enough with this, right? To some extent, I'm giving my own commentary here, but enough with this, idealistic form of, everybody can get along, right? We all have the Torah, right? We have religious leadership, we can make it work, right? We need actual governance, just like other countries, right? We need bureaucracy and institutions and leaders, right? So what happens? But when they say, give us a king, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel, right? So Samuel, the idealistic religious leader, is upset. So of course, what do you do when you're a religious leader and upset, right? You go and ask God what God thinks of the situation, right? So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you that they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, right? Very harsh words, right? We'll unpack this in a bit. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as their rights, right? So God is basically saying a twofold argument, right? This want to elect a human leader over you is in some way, and we can discuss this, and debate this, is in some way a rejection of the core claim of ethical monotheism that the Torah was trying to teach, right? In an ideal world, and this is certainly what Maimonides writes and other Jewish thinkers that are analyzing these verses write, in an ideal world, again, we don't live in an ideal world, so we're here, but in an ideal world, once people have the ethical imperatives that are in the Torah and other previous texts in Jewish literature, everybody would realize, okay, we need to find some way to get along, almost a very utopian, vision of how society should look, right? Why do we need leaders, right? We'll figure it out, right? We can, keep on making this argument, go down in sort of a further rabbit hole, right? Why do we need anybody in charge, right? Everybody will come together to do what's good for, society writ large. And so in some way, this idea that we're not up to this task is at least depicted in the book of Shmuel as a rejection of some sort of religious ideal, right? Well, we'll come back to this later, because one of the things that we see, and one of the great parts about Jewish history and Jewish tradition that we'll hopefully see throughout these 10 weeks, is later Jewish thinkers, again, in our wider analysis of history and memory, always harken back to the past to make present arguments. So later prophets in 200-300 years from now, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, right? These prophets whose basically chief claim is to rail against corruption of bureaucracy, they're basically pointing to this. They say, see, look at what happened, right? You think you can elect human leaders to run institutions and things aren't going to be corrupt, right? Basically, we told you so, right? So we'll get back to that a little bit in a second, right? Just to finish the story, and then we'll get some thoughts and questions here. So what happened? Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king, and now Samuel is going to basically give them a warning. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. What's going to happen? The king's going to gain power, and all of a sudden he's going to create a draft, or all of a sudden he's going to take your sons and be like, you know, they actually work for me now, right? I'm in charge, right? He's going to take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his attendants, right? And again, note the irony here, which is the ideal of this society. You are actually supposed to take the best of produce and offer it to God, right? So this is a veiled critique of what's happening in society, right? They're almost using produce here as a metaphor, right? This used to be a society, you know, you can imagine the sort of, person lamenting the situation. Oh, there was once a day when Moshe was saying to take the best of our society and produce and offer it to God. And now basically, you know, there's going to be corruption in the government and the king is going to take it, right? So a lot of embedded irony here, right? He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants, right? Also something that Moses tells the Israelites to do, right? Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkey he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourself will become his slave. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you had chosen, but God will not answer you in that day. So Shmuel gives this entire critique and warning, right? Foreshadowing what might happen. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. When Samuel heard that all the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king. Then Samuel said to the Israelites, everybody go back to your own town. A little bit of, certainly a little bit of humor there. And by the way, this will be the last text, and then I'll unshare the screen and we can have a little bit of conversation about these tensions here. In the book of Deuteronomy, there is discussion about a king, and it's not framed in very favorable light, right? So this is, I'm going back in books, but this is the book of Deuteronomy. And here's what Deuteronomy says. If after you have entered the land that the Lord your God has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled it, you decide, right? This is if you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. Be sure to set as a king over yourself one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kinsman. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. Since the Lord had warned you, you must not go back that way again. And he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. When he is seated on the royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. So if you're going to have a king, Deuteronomy warns, you got to basically set very strict parameters, and he basically has to wear a Torah scroll as a necklace to constantly remind him, you are not God, right? Lest it remain with him, and let him read it all his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, to observe faithfully every word of his teaching, as well as these laws. Thus he will not act haughtily towards his fellows or deviate from the instruction to the right or to the left, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. So I want to unshare my screen again for people that want to keep reading through those quotes. I think it's still in the chat here. I'll share it one more time because I know some people just joined us. But we have a major tension here, right? A tension that is not completely foreign, I think, to any political structure, but to some extent, there's an admission here, and I'm really curious to hear thoughts, or at least an idea that early Jewish literature is presenting us, that any sort of political institution or political structure, one, there's going to be corruption, which I think, again, there's a lot of wider conversation about power here, right? And Jewish tradition, right? One of the things that I always say is Jewish tradition does not believe that power is always bad, right? We're not, anti-power, but Jewish tradition certainly believes that power can be very easily corrupting and is very skeptical of people that attempt to claim power for themselves, because there's always what's really going on here, right? And so we see a major tension here, right? This is, to some extent, the first wider communal tension debate of Jewish history, of what happens when the ideal can't happen and all of a sudden you need a leader, right? And this is, again, we can spend an entire 10 weeks just on this question, because there's a lot of other stories in the Tanakh. There's the pro-king stories and the anti-king stories. We can obviously guess, which camp scholars attribute the writing of these texts to, but we have this major debate here. I'm curious to get some thoughts, whether or not people have some intuition in this, or, in terms of wider themes happening here.
I'm thinking no good deed goes unpunished. Everything has its upside and its downside. This is the way of the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really important, and I think even maybe adding a little bit to it, there's a acknowledgement here that there's no, that any political system you set up, basically, there isn't going to be that perfect political system that they're gonna come up with. I mean, this is, again, a very realistic picture of both sides, right? Of the potential corruption of what happens when you have political leadership and bureaucracy, and on the other hand, the fact that you actually need these institutions, because the times of judges just didn't work, and so you can't have a society with no bureaucracy and leadership. And also, every time you insert bureaucracy or leadership into a society, inevitably something's going to go wrong, and somebody's going to try to take power and everything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're dealing with human beings, and we all have good inclinations and evil inclinations. The human being is imperfect.
100%. Henry, go for it.
Yeah, so isn't it interesting that we don't hear about the tribal leadership at all? Even in medieval England and before then, you had, the barons and you had this whole leadership structure that led up to the king, and we don't have that here at all. It probably existed if these territories still existed, but it's not mentioned at all.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting, and it's mostly the same with Tanakh. I mean, the exception is a little bit. I mean, the Book of Judges goes into a little bit what's happening there. Marilyn, go for it.
Well, I think this is so self-evident in our world, how every midterm election of a president votes in many more of the opposite party, because we're not in a perfect world, and no leader can possibly satisfy everybody's needs. So there's always dissatisfaction, and the tides turn.
Yeah, 100%. And it takes a certain amount of almost traditional. When I say traditional, I don't mean traditional as in people who are traditional, but the maturity of our tradition to point out that it's inevitable, meaning, this is something that's going to happen. So almost this isn't, I mean, depending on which side of this debate we would have fallen out if we were all dropped into 1200 BCE ancient Israel, right? Of acknowledging, okay, we do need some sort of political system, and don't expect it to be perfect, because every time we expect something to be perfect and it's not perfect, the intuition is, okay, throw it out. It doesn't work, as opposed to, how can we make this a little bit less not perfect, as opposed to, right, this quest for perfection, which, by the way, I mean, because this is constantly a mix of, history and tradition Jewish thought and philosophy, the idea that humans can create anything that's perfect is how our tradition explains idol worship, right? So the idea that we can create anything, right, be it a statue or be it an institution that is infallible, is, according to Maimonides, and again, according to mainstream Jewish tradition, anybody who claims to be infallible, basically what they're claiming is that they're God, because their tradition does not believe perfection exists outside of God. Mark.
Yeah, so I look at this a little differently. It's the same reason that people created idols. To say God is our king is kind of vague, and people want to have something they can actually talk to and see and revere. So to me, the desire to have a king was no different than the desire to have idols. So once again, refusing to accept God as king and hope for the best.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think to some extent, that's what the book of Samuel is getting at when, I mean, they don't say it as explicitly as you just said, but I think that's at least a very probable reading of what's going on there. Any other thoughts or comments on this before we see what happens once a king is elected? Susan, go for it.
Was ancient Israel a theocracy like the Catholic Church where the Pope was up there? Weren't the Cohens getting all the things that were supposed to go to God? Weren't they organized?
Kind of. So one of the things that we'll see in a little bit is it was basically an attempt, fairly, historians can judge whether how successful, but there was an attempt to have a division of powers between, there were three main types of leaders that we'll be introduced to. One is the king and the political leadership, which always came from the Davidic line, right? So King David ends up being not actually the first king. The first king was a guy named Saul, but Saul was only king over a very small area and he only lasted a couple of years. And so really King David is thought of as the first king of Israel. And that started the Davidic line. So the king was a hereditary position of David, Solomon, Rehoboam, right? That line. You also had another sort of hereditary dynasty, which was the priests and the Levites, right? They were people from the tribe of Levi. And they were, again, the people who were in charge of the uptake of the temple and the rituals and the sacrifice. And then you also had prophets who are basically these outsiders. And when I say outsiders, I don't mean outside of the Jewish community, but outside of any inherited position, right? Prophets weren't picked because, well, my dad was a prophet and my grandfather was a prophet, right? Kings were picked because my dad and grandfather were kings. Levites and priests were picked because my dad and grandfather were Levites. When it came to a prophet, right, all bets were off, right? Prophets come from everywhere. Prophets can also, importantly, because we'll get into this a little bit later, prophets, right, not only is there no hereditary becoming of a prophet, but anybody can, anybody, which in the ancient world was quite radical, right? So there are stories of we have prophets that come from destitution. One prophet that we're actually introduced to throughout the early Tanakh is described as being the son of a prostitute, right? We have female prophets, right? So the way in which this sort of, right, which again was quite radical for, if we go back 2,800 years ago, there weren't exactly a lot of female leaders running around the ancient Middle East, but yet our tradition at least has, the most famous is Deborah, the prophet, right? But our tradition does view there being, prophets can basically, prophecy to some extent is a meritocracy, unlike these other institutions, which are hereditary. And one of the things we'll either see at the end of today or next week is this clash, because the priests / king were not always too fond of the prophets, and the prophets were not always too fond of the king / priests. And this basically takes us through the entire center chunk of the Tanakh, is the prophetic critique of, institution, right? So the prophets were not fond of the kings, the prophets were not fond of the priests, prophets were not fond of the temple. So we'll get into that a little bit. Michael asked, prophets are what we call today rabbis. It's a good question. I would say not in a literal sense, meaning from a traditional Jewish perspective, the idea that prophecy was sort of taken away at some point of the Second Temple, right? So if we have this vision of prophecy being a literal talking to God and getting a message, right? Nobody basically after 300 BCE that called themselves a prophet was accepted in the Jewish community as being a prophet. In terms of the type of leadership that they embodied, I would agree. Meaning rabbis today, outside of, let's say Hasidic dynasties, right? That's an anomaly. But most rabbis today are not rabbis because their dad and grandfather and great grandfather, or mom and grandmother and great grandmother were rabbis, and they were born being a rabbi, right? Being a rabbi today is much more of a, outside calling to some extent, meritocracy, right? That you want to do it, not that, from the age of 2, everybody's been saying, you're going to be the next king. All of that. Ruth, go for it.
I think of prophets, I mean, like Isaiah, wandering out in the wilderness. Sometimes I wonder if they weren't smoking something, but, out there criticizing, chastising the Jewish people and being an itch. And, they went their own way. And did anybody ever kill a prophet for criticizing them?
I don't believe so. I'm like running through the stories. I mean, they were definitely treated badly. I mean, we'll introduce Isaiah in a few minutes, but one of the things, I mean, Isaiah, or Yeshayahu in Hebrew, ends up being the sort of paradigm of the critique of everything that was going on. And, the book has described him as, being lashed out on, and, he was suffering. And at one point he was wandering through Israel with basically no belongings and barefoot, because everybody hated him so much that even stores basically denied him clothing, right? So they definitely weren't loved. And then Mark says Judges. Yeah, Judges basically, in some sense, served as prophets also, in sort of this more attempt for lack of centralized leadership, right? What we really have here to some extent, and the important tension that I think we see in this debate about a king, and we'll see even more once we're introduced to Isaiah, is this sort of endless debate between, do we want centralization or decentralization? And both have their pitfalls, and both have their times where they're important. And so, to some extent, you have, people staking out the idealistic positions, right? You have the kings and the priests on one side that are staking out a position of institutions are everything and tradition is everything and everything like that. On the other hand, you have these outside figures, prophets, saying institutions and tradition have no value, right? Let's throw them out the door, and, we'll create society anew, and it'll be utopian. And these two forces collapsing in on each other and having this sort of endless battle for the future of society. This is actually, just one more tangent, and then we'll get back into the actual sources. Max Weber, who was a famous German sociologist, he wrote a number of books. I think he's seen by a lot of people as being one of the sort of founding fathers of sociology. He was sort of a contemporary of Karl Marx, right, in Germany, right at this time in the 19th century. He writes a book called Sociology of Religion, and he actually uses as his case study everything, a lot of what we're discussing today. And what he basically says is true for all societies that are healthy, is they're made up of what he considers the archetypical prophet and the archetypical priest, which means in all societies, you have people on one side that say, we need to keep tradition and do everything the exact same way it's always been done. And people on the other side of the debate that basically say, tear everything down, tradition has no value, right? Let's enact these idealistic laws right now and create utopia. And basically, these two forces in society are very important counterbalancing forces. And if a society only has one of them, something goes terribly wrong. And so, the healthiest societies have both. And this is sort of his sociological reading of the world, but also it's interesting that he uses our time in Jewish history, right? He was, a religious Protestant, right? So he was very well familiar with these biblical stories to sort of build his argument. Okay, I'm going to reshare my screen here. And just to carry on a little bit in history, because I think we've only done about 200 years so far. So I promised at least 400 or 500. Okay, so what ends up happening, right? Again, just to sort of fill in the historic gaps, right? So, the people end up electing a king. And that first king, again, not counting Saul, which is a whole different saga, that first king ends up being King David. And King David ends up doing a pretty good job, right? He doesn't fall prey to a lot of the corruption that they were warned about, although there are exceptions, right? There was the whole episode with Bathsheba, And he basically, you know, for lack of a better word, he sends Bathsheba's husband out to die, right? So David is a very mixed bag in terms of, you know, how Jewish tradition views him. And what's interesting actually about David is King David's story is the longest story we have in the Tanakh, right? So it actually goes from, if you see here, from 1 Samuel 8 all the way to now we're in the book of 2 Samuel, and this is still the middle of David's story. So David's story takes, you know, hundreds of pages basically to unfold. There's been a lot of really interesting stuff written about David that, you know, one of the best books I think was written by Rabbi David Wolpe, and it was just called David. And he basically does a full-on analysis of, you know, all the stories in the Tanakh about King David. But, you know, for the purposes of, you know, bird's eye view of Jewish history, King David ends up being the first king. And the most important thing that King David does is unites all of these tribes, right? So if we remember back to our map that was up above, I don't want to scroll because I don't want people to get motion sickness if I keep moving the screen. But if anybody's in the document, right, you can see this map of all these different tribes. And up until now, again, there was no centralized leadership. First thing King David does is basically bring everybody together and become the king over what is called United Israel. And so once that happens, right, it seems like, you know, almost a happily ever after story, right? King David unites the people and everything like that. We now get towards the end of his life, right? King David was living in his palace and the Lord had given him peace from all his enemies around him, right? So, you know, the job to some extent is done, but now what happens? King David says to Nathan the prophet, right? Nathan was David's loyal prophet. And again, this is actually, interestingly enough, during King David's time, this prophetic critique of monarchy actually worked, right? The most famous time, again, where Nathan or Nathan the prophet critiques David is in the whole Bathsheba ordeal, where Nathan basically comes to King David and says, you know, I have a parable, or, you know, I have a story for you. You know, say there's this guy who's really rich and has a ton of donkeys, and there's this other guy who's really poor and has one donkey, and the rich guy basically comes and steals the poor guy's donkey. Is that a good guy? And David's like, no, of course not. And he says, well, that's basically what you did to Uri when you took Bathsheba. And David has this sort of, oh my God, right? And, you know, certainly feels, you know, he accepts the message, right? So at least to some extent, this form of different powers and having the prophets be able to critique the kings at least worked a little bit initially, right? We'll see soon that does not end up working later on, but at least first generation, right, it was fine, right? So he says to Nathan, look, I'm living in a palace made of cedar wood, but the ark of God is in a tent, right? What does he mean by that? I'm living in this nice castle in Jerusalem, and God is still in, you know, the portable tabernacle back in the days of the desert, right? God has just been, you know, hanging out in, you know, at least God, to the extent that we imagine God resides in a physical place, right? God has been, you know, for lack of a better word, hanging out in Shiloh, right? A city in the north, right? So David said, basically, this is not appropriate, right? So Nathan said to the king, go and do what you really want to do because the Lord is with you. So Nathan says, you know, it sounds like you want to build the temple, go for it. But that night, the Lord spoke his word to Nathan. Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Will you really build a house for me to live in? From the time I brought the Israelites out of Egypt until now, I have not lived in a house. I have been moving all around this time with a tent as my home. As I have moved with the Israelites, I have never said to the tribes who I commanded to take care of my people Israel, why haven't you built me a house of cedar, right? Almost mocking David to some extent. You must tell my servant David, this is what the all-powerful Lord says. I took you from the pasture and from the tending of the sheep and made you leader of my people Israel, right? David started out as a shepherd, right? I had been with you everywhere you go. Sorry, I'm just going to scroll here. And defeated your enemies for you. I will make you as famous as any of the great people on earth. Also, I will choose a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so they can live in their own homes. They will not be bothered anymore. Wicked people will no longer bother them as they have in the past. When I choose judges for my people Israel, but I will give you peace from all your enemies. I also tell you that I will make your descendants kings of Israel after you. So he's trying to basically tell Nathan to tell David, I don't really need, you know, a physical temple here, right? This seems like a bad idea, right? We can discuss why exactly that might be a bad idea in a second. But this is considered by scholars, by the way, 2 Samuel 7 to be one of the most important chapters of the Tanakh, because this is sort of the Davidic promise. And it's actually interesting. I was, thinking about this and preparing and reading some sources. And so I have, just an aside, the head of Jewish studies at UCLA, where I was, wrote an entire book basically on the reception history of the first couple of verses of this chapter. And so this is, again, the subject of a lot of scholarly work of exactly what's going on here. And we probably don't have time to read an entire academic book about it, but I'll try to give some commentary sporadic. So he tells David, when you die and join your ancestors, I will make one of your sons the next king, and I will set up his kingdom. He will build a house for me, and I will let his kingdom rule always. I will be his father, and he will be my sons. When he sins, I will use other people to punish him. They will be my whips. I took my love away from Saul, whom I removed before you, but I will never stop loving your son. But your family and your kingdom will continue always before me. Your throne will last forever. There's a good reason why there's an entire academic book about the reception history of this, because later Jewish thinkers just had no clue what to make of this, of what's going on, right? This seems, and at least the mainstream Jewish traditional view, and there are of course others, is this seems like this is a undiluted promise to David that no matter what your ancestors, your descendants do, they're always going to be leaders. Which again, going back to what we were talking about before, Jewish thinkers found very problematic, right? What does that mean? David's sons and grandsons and great-grandsons are always going to be leaders no matter what they do, right? That doesn't seem like that correlates with the rest of what we're trying to build here. Henry, go for it.
I can't help but think, guess who wrote this paragraph? David,
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and again, there's an interesting, one of the things that again, if we were taking, if this was, I'll put it this way, if this was an academic Jewish history class, and the reason why everybody was here was because we were PhD students trying to unpack what really happened in 1000 BCE, that would be exactly where we would go with this, right? We would analyze all these texts and basically say, okay, the people who wrote the anti-king texts, they probably weren't the kings, and the people who wrote the pro-king, right? This is a little bit of an oversimplification, but this is a lot of times what scholars do, right? Jewish tradition, of course, doesn't go that route, but yes, definitely good point. Ruth, go for it.
Well, the Christians certainly picked up on it because they claim that Jesus was descended from David.
Yeah, 100%. And there's this idea now, right? Of course, right? If you read some of the early, I think the book of Luke, right? It gives the whole lineage of Jesus, and what do you know? It goes back to David, right? And again, this was a common theme. Again, not just, Christianity took this to the next level, but Jewish tradition also has this, meaning, one of the names for Mashiach, or the Messiah in Jewish tradition, is Mashiach ben David, right? So we also say, a lot of times, right? Jewish tradition has never been as messianically focused as, our Christian or Islamic neighbors, but this 100%, right? It makes it so that if you're going to be a future Jewish king or Messiah, you have to basically become the king of, from David's messianic lineage, which, by the way, we'll probably end up discussing this in a month and a half, but just to get people excited, the birth of Jewish mysticism, which I know this seems like a whole left field tangent, but bear with me for a second, right? The height of Jewish mysticism was in, let's say, 1500, 1600 Sfat, right? That's when a lot of what we now think to be Kabbalah was born. And one of the things that the Kabbalists immediately did was they became very obsessed with lineages. And they went around Israel, and actually, this is sort of I always feel like I'm sort of ruining Santa Claus for people in some way when I say this. A lot of the graves in Israel today, when people say, oh, this is where Abraham's buried, oh, this is where this person's buried, a lot of them were basically mystical guesswork by 16th century Kabbalists. Not saying they're right, not saying they're wrong, but if anybody ever points to you and says, yeah, this is where Joseph is buried, and this is where David's buried, and you're on a tour, in Jerusalem or Shechem or, any of these places, high probability that this was probably someone 400 years ago going around trying to figure out. Henry, I'll take your point in 1 second. Just to finish this thought about the Kabbalists. So the Kabbalists become very obsessed with Messianic age, which is why, the Hasidic Jews, which basically took Kabbalah and repackaged it in Hasidic Judaism, became very obsessed with this idea of the Rebbe as almost a semi-divine quasi figure. One of the things that they did was they started to claim that a lot of their Rebbes, which was dynastic, actually went back to David. And this presented a huge problem because people started to take this and again, usurp power. The most infamous example is a man named Shabtai Tzvi, who actually claimed to be the Messiah. This is in the late 1600s, early 1700s, I think, who basically, led hundreds of thousands of Jews completely off the deep end by claiming, I'm the Messiah. We're going to march, he was in Turkey. We're going to march from Turkey to Jerusalem and everything's going to be great, right? So there's a lot of danger in this sort of game of dynastic predictions. Both, it doesn't matter if it's, which community it's coming from. Henry, we're going to say something?
Well, two things now. Wasn't he the same guy who converted to Islam?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you brought up the point of the Kabbalists going around Israel and locating graves and points of religious importance. I believe that the Catherine, the mother of one of the Roman kings, did the same thing, and there are places, there are Christian areas, points of interest that she said, oh, this must be this place, this must be that place. And someone once said to me, when millions of people believe something, then it's then it's the truth. So.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it sort of, de facto became true in Israel also. I mean, Marat HaMachpelah in Hebron, or Kever Rachel, right outside Jerusalem, or Kever Yosef, right, where Joseph is presumably buried right outside of Shem. These are, holy sites, and, whether or not, right? Are they actually historically there? Who knows, right? Is that where Jewish tradition remembers they're there? Of course. And so you're going to have that sort of power there also. Just sort of getting us back in history here, right? So this promise that God makes to David, and sort of giving him this imperative both to lead and to have his descendants lead, again, is the subject of much discussion and controversy and debate among Jewish sources. I sort of brought this book just so you take my word for it when I said, this bothered a lot of Jewish thinkers, in terms of what exactly was happening here. And it is unclear how this legacy ended up continuing, because one of the things that we see throughout the rest of Tanakh is David's great-grandchildren start to sin, and they start to do bad things, and they do get punished. And so, this idea that when he sins, I will use other people to be my whips, but your family will continue always and your throne will last forever. The obvious problem for Jewish history there is that the throne did not last forever. The throne lasted a couple hundred years, and then the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem. And for some segment of the Jewish tradition and population, it seemed like Judaism's over now, because God gave us this promise that you're going to have a kingdom that lasts forever, and the kingdom does not last forever. Now what, right? So that's definitely the subtext behind here. Okay, so King David ends up dying. He appoints his son Solomon, or Shlomo, after him. Shlomo, did a lot, but perhaps the thing that Shlomo is most famous for, right, the thing that we need to know about King Solomon is he was the one who actually built the temple, right? So we say Solomon's temple, right? And King Solomon is living in about the year 950 BCE, right? So just for people who are more timeline inclined. So David is usually, right, thought to be around 1000. Solomon's maybe 960, 950. I always tell college students, whenever anybody gives you a hard and fast date from more than a couple hundred years ago, it's always give or take, 20 to 50 years. But we don't exactly have a diary from King Solomon. It is the year, He probably would have counted on some other calendars because obviously they were not thinking that they were in the year 950 BCE, in 950 BCE. So King Solomon ends up ruling. And now we get to our next, just major Jewish historical inflection point here, which is again, we'll see, when we study history, we see themes that basically come up again and again, right? Even if the exact situation is different, right? So King Solomon ends up building the temple, right? And he dies. So now we've had David and Solomon, and they both ruled over what's considered united Israel. And King Solomon had a son. His son was named Rehoboam. And Rehoboam becomes the next king of Israel. And here's what happens, right? We're now zooming in, right? We're now in the next book of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the book of Kings, right? And again, for people who are so inclined, and I can again send out, I'll try to send out a timeline sometime this week, all of the filling in the gaps, right? At least in this point of our slog through Jewish history, can be found in the pages of the Tanakh. So if anybody's saying, well, what ended up happening? What did David do after this? What was, Solomon's upbringing, right? This is the books of Samuel and the books of Kings. So all of a sudden we're introduced to David's grandson, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, and he goes to Shechem, right? And Shechem is, again, one of the city centers, right? Almost think of Shechem as New York City, right? It's not the capital, but it's the cultural center, right? So Shechem is the New York City of the ancient Israelite world, right? So going to Shechem is basically, going and speaking in the town square in New York City, and it's where things happen, right? So he went to Shechem, for all of Israel has gone to make him king, right? When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, right? He ended up, he was in Egypt, right? There's a whole backstory because he had to flee from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt, right? They sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam. I don't know why these two names are so similar. This is always an endless source of confusion between Rehoboam and Yerovam. I apologize. I did not create the names here in the Tanakh. So we have Rehoboam, who is now the new king of Israel, right? He's the third king, right? Or fourth, if we're counting Saul, right? And what do they say to him, right? So now the people are coming to Rehoboam, and they're saying, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you, right? So the people go and they basically give a very somewhat reasonable ultimatum, right? Your father put a heavy yoke on us. What does that mean? Probably what that means is David and Solomon undertook major building projects, right? David built Jerusalem up and the temple. Solomon built the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, right? Probably costed, millions and billions of dollars. And that means tax increases because the money doesn't come from nowhere. And so they're saying to this new king, okay, things are built. Your father did this to us, right? Lighten the load a little bit. Rehoboam says, go away for 3 days and then come back to me. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. And he says, how would you advise me to answer these people, right? So he consults with his sort of surrounding group. They replied, if today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. So the advisors say, yeah, listen to the people, right? It's what a good leader should do. But what happens, of course, but Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. So what does he do? I don't need these older people giving me this wisdom. I'll just ask my friends, right? What does his friends say? He asked them, what is your advice? How should we answer this people who say, lighten the yoke your fathers put on me? The young men who he had grown up with, so his friend group says, these people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make your yoke lighter. You should tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. So again, friends giving less than ideal advice. So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over him. So what happens? The Israelites go to their homes and they reject his kingship. So all of a sudden there's some crisis brewing, right? What happens? King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of labor, but Israel killed him, right? So again, Rehoboam becomes king. The people ask him to lighten the load, right? The people meaning most of the people in the rest of Israel. Rehoboam refuses. The people are disobeying him, right? This is the first governmental crisis of the Davidic kingdom. He sends his advisor to basically say, you guys haven't done either your taxes or the work that you promised to do. Sends his advisor and they stone him. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day, right? This can help us date when the source was written. But we're told that this created a schism. When all the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent him and called him to the assembly and made him king over Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. Again, Jeroboam is the other guy, right? Rehoboam becomes king of the south, right? I put a nice map here because these names are very similar, right? Rehoboam becomes king of Judah and Jeroboam becomes king of the north, right? An interesting way to think about this, by the way, is Jerusalem as sort of the capital city, right? This is a classic, to some extent, argument about taxation. To some extent, it's interesting the parallels here, but Judah and Jerusalem are the center, right? It's where the major building projects are being undertaken, right? It's actually, right, if you think about modern day Israel and where this is situated, right, a little bit more in the south alongside the Dead Sea, this is not the place where the majority of farming takes place. That would be in the north, right? So you have the rural northerners, and then you have the Jerusalem people in Judah who are raising taxes to do building project, right? There's a lot of really interesting parallels that we can read into here, but this results in about the year 920 BCE into what's called the divided kingdom, right? And the divided kingdom, right, here's what ended up happening. When Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he mustered all of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 able young men to go to war against Israel and to regain the kingdom for Rehoboam, son of Solomon, right? So what happened, right? Judah mobilized, right? There was about to be a major civil war happening, but all of a sudden, right, the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all Judah and Benjamin and to the rest of the people, this is what the Lord said, do not go up and fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. So they obeyed the word of the God and went home as the Lord had ordered, right? So major civil war crisis averted here. But now you still have two kingdoms. So what happened? Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived up there. So Jeroboam ends up making Shechem his capital city, right? For anybody who's been to modern day Israel, the distance between Jerusalem and Shechem, I mean, I didn't look this up, but it can't be more than 30 miles. I mean, 30 might even be generous, right? This is very close, right? So Rehoboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim. From there, he went out and built up Peniel, right? Peniel ends up becoming a major worship site, right, in the north. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to the Lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. So now, right, Jeroboam, who's the king of the north, again, apologies about the names, right? Jeroboam, who's the king of the north, has a problem. What's your problem? Okay, we've created this separation, but guess what's still in Jerusalem? Solomon's temple. Guess where everybody goes to worship? Solomon's temple. You can't have that, right? If you're trying to create your separate autonomous state, basically, or governance or empire, you can't allow your people to go down south to Judah to worship, because then all the power is going to be there, and Rehoboam's going to have the upper hand. So what does he do? After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought them out of Egypt. One he set up in Beit El and the other in Dan, right? So just so we know where this is, Beit El is here and Dan is all the way in the north, right? In the modern day Golan Heights. You can actually go, for anybody who's been to the modern day Golan Heights in Israel, there's a place called Tel Dan, right? Tel just means ancient city. And it's one of the most interesting archaeological sites in ancient Israel, because they've actually uncovered a massive temple that virtually all archaeologists and historians date back to this was the northern temple in Dan, right? So again, King Yeroboam creates these golden calves. One he sets up in Beit El, the other in Dan, and this thing became a sin, right? The people came to worship the one at Beit El and even went so far as Dan to worship the other, right? As if to say they went all the way, right? Dan, Dan is in the middle of the middle of nowhere, right? The middle of the fields and hills. So this gets us to now our next major chunk of Jewish history. So just to go back to our timeline and review, and then we can have some time for questions of just everything we've done today, because we did bite off a large chunk of history, even as I've tried to make it seem less like history bullet points. So we started out in about 1400 BCE, right, with the end of Moses' leadership and the Exodus, and then the subsequent conquest of the land of Israel. We talked about how this sort of period of 1400 to 1000 was this almost political no man's land, right? This is the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, the book of Samuel, where there was no centralized leadership. There was seeming chaos, right? You had the tribes. It was every tribe for themselves. You have this whole ideological debate about political leadership. We then introduced to the kings, right? The first king was Saul. We didn't talk much about him, but a whole interesting other side story, but really we focused on David and Solomon. And then right after Solomon comes the divided kingdom. So we've gone from 1400 to now we're in 900. So we did our promised 500 years. So now we're left, and we'll pick up next week. And again, I'll stay for questions and thoughts. Where we're left with now is a divided kingdom, right? You have a king in the south, a king in the north. You have a temple in the south in Jerusalem. You have multiple temples in the north. And obviously this is a recipe for, disaster to some extent, because if you're trying to view, right, this is Israel, right? The people of Israel, you probably don't want to have them divided. The last fun fact that I'll throw in, and I'll enter my screen, and this will be the last thing I say here, the reason why Jews today are called Jews and not Israelites is because the South and Judah end up winning. And we'll discuss this next week. And, the North ends up getting wiped out by the Assyrians, right? We'll start with that next Monday. But presumably everybody who is Jewish, obviously people could convert, but assuming we're talking, Jews that can trace their lineage back 2,700 years are basically either from the tribe of Judah, from the tribe of Levi, because Levi was spread around, or they were actually refugees from the north and ended up coming down and living amongst Judah. But once this happened, right, from about the year 722 and on, which we'll start with next week, Jews ceased to be called Israelites. So people always get confused in terms of Jewish history. I have students ask me all the time. They're like, I don't get it. When do we stop? What are Israelites? What are Jews? Right. So this is when we start to see this differentiation between Jews and all of Israel. And then Mark says the golden calves never end well. Yes. A good lesson from Jewish history is if you think you're going to build the golden calf to solve all your problems, it almost never works there. Any thoughts, any questions, anything sort of left unanswered in the last couple of minutes?
Did you leave out the tribe of Benjamin that was part of the South?
Say that one more time. Sorry, you cut out a little
The
bit.
tribe of Benjamin that was with the tribe of Judah in the South.
Yeah, so Benjamin ends up being, there's a lot to say about Benjamin. Benjamin, to some extent, ends up also existing in the South. Benjamin isn't treated too well by subsequent Jewish sources. So Saul was famously from the tribe of Benjamin. Mordechai, actually, in the Purim story, was from the tribe of Benjamin. So some Benjaminites did survive to some extent, but there's a whole, we can talk endlessly about why, but the people in Judah didn't take too kindly to the tribe of Benjamin. There was actually, just going into the political weeds here, Jerusalem is described in the Tanakh as being on the border of Judah and Benjamin. And so half of Jerusalem was in the tribe of Judah, half was in the tribe of Benjamin. We know that there was a lot of sort of fighting over who laid claim to, Jerusalem and the Temple Mount and everything like that. So probably what ended up happening, and I'm sort of summarizing a lot of different scholarly opinions here, is at a certain point, the tribe of Benjamin just basically assimilated into Judah. But some families in Judah, almost like last names today, might have kept their name. Oh yeah, Mordechai in the Purim story is Ish Yemini, right? A man of Benjamin. But it's almost like, there were a lot of Ashkenazi Jews that ended up moving to Sephardi lands hundreds of years ago and kept the name Ashkenazi. And so ironically, you'll meet Sephardic Jews and you'll say, what's your last name? And they'll say Ashkenazi. And you say, well, go figure, right? What that really means historically is an Ashkenazi family who found themselves moving into the Sephardic world that basically wanted to make sure that they kept their name. And so they said, we're Ashkenazi, but functionally they're basically Sephardic Jews. Henry, go for it.
So we're Jews today because Judah won, but our homeland is now called Israel, the area that lost. So can you explain that? Was that Ben-Gurion's idea?
So no, right? Just to, I guess, unpack it a little bit. Israel ends up coming with this double meaning throughout Tanakh, because we're called Am Yisrael throughout the Tanakh, right? The nation of Israel, or the Israelites, but the land is also called Eretz Israel. So it already starts to get this sort of double meaning. Although I will say there was an early attempt, right? A lot of early references in Judah to the land of Israel was not called Israel. It was called Sion or Zion, right? So if we read texts that were produced by Judah or by, right, this is getting into next week, right, by the Jews, right, at this point they're called Jews, during the Babylonian exile, because, again, we'll talk next week, the Babylonians come in the year 586 and destroy the first temple, and all of a sudden most of the Jews get shipped off to Babylonia, and they're writing longingly about this land. They're not calling it Israel, they're calling it Sion. But for whatever reason, I don't claim to know the exact reason, in later Jewish sources, certainly in the Talmud and Midrash, it's back to being called Israel. It probably would be an interesting study as why Zion and Israel, that sort of that thing. And then, yeah, Michael says that Jacob becomes Israel, which we discussed a little bit last week. Ruth, go for it.
I'm thinking that Judah with Jerusalem and then all of the building, I'm thinking were they more sophisticated, more urban, and then you had the yokels up there in the north, farmers. I once read a book called Judah, and it was about, I was by an Israeli author, and it said, Jesus came from the Galilee and he came south, and he was like a bumpkin, a country bumpkin, and that Judas Iscariot was from the south, and he was more sophisticated. So I'm wondering if it isn't like flyover country in our, here when they talk about flyover country, and then the coasts, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, inside the Tanakh, that argument was definitely made. Meaning, there's a really interesting. I mean, one of the ways this is getting more into the academic view. One of the chief ways in which scholars date different sources and try to figure out, who wrote what when, to nod to Henry's point before, is specifically on this issue. Because there's a lot of stories in the Tanakh that talk favorably about the North. There's a lot of stories that talk degradingly about the North. And so all these things are in play. Your best bet, if you're reading, a verse from, because all these books, again, just to get into a little bit of academic methodology here, right? We have one question about the historicity of all these stories, right? We addressed that last week. The second question is, given historicity of these stories, because a lot of the stuff we did today is historical, right? But the text still went through layers of editing and redacting, right? So even if, right, you might have had, a lot of the stories, let's say in the books of in the book of Judges, let's say they are based on historic events, you can almost guarantee these books were edited and copied and, interpreted generation after generation. So a lot of the things that scholars will do is they'll open up the book of Judges, which is full of this intertribal warfare, and some verses and stories will make the North seem exactly what you just said. These are a bunch of idiots, right? Even when they do have a leader, their leader's an idiot. And then other stories do the same thing about the South, right? Judah's corrupt, right? Just one example here, I don't want to take us too far off the deep end. There's an entire, right? Judah has an entire subplot in the Torah, right? As a figure, right? Some of the side plot of Judah makes him seem great, and some of it makes him seem terrible, right? He ends up committing, some act of harlotry with some woman, and then, so, right, there is sort of a political interplay happening here, which, of course, is not how Jewish tradition analyzes these texts, but from a more academic historic view, it could be interesting.
Yeah, I just have a question because we're saying that this is history. Is it because the archaeologists have found evidence of these civilizations? I mean, how, we don't have anything left from Joseph or Jacob or even Abraham, but here when, we can see that David was building the city. Well, the city of David is in Jerusalem, and they've uncovered that. Is that why we can say that it's historical?
The short answer is yes. It's funny. I actually was I was in the hot tub 2 nights ago with a UCI professor, and this exact topic came up, not connected to this class at all. And he was trying to argue to me that, we don't actually know if David existed. He probably didn't exist. And I was on the other side. I was like, no, historians and archaeologists do think so. So this is not a shut and closed case. But yes, what most historians will tell you is, there's sort of a multi-pronged approach, right? We have the Tanakh, we have what we know about archaeology, we have what we know about other literature. So they found a 9th century stela, which is just, a big rock from sometime in the late 800s, so like maybe 880 BCE, that talks about the kingdom of David. So these clues, and then you get into a wider philosophic debate, which is what we were talking about, which is you can be an archaeological minimalist or an archaeological maximalist, or somewhere in between, right? The maximalist will say, I believe everything that a text says happened unless proven otherwise. And the minimalist will say, I believe none of it happened unless proven otherwise. And then, at some point, the archaeological record is a little bit of a crapshoot. I mean, the most interesting thing about archaeology is, let's say in the late 1800s, they found, a synagogue in Cairo. There's this idea that if you have God's name on something, you can't throw it out, right? So what do? You either bury it or put it in a room, right? So they found, they unearthed this Geniza in Cairo. It's called the Cairo Geniza from 900, 800 years ago. And basically, we knew almost nothing about what life was like for Jews in Spain and then subsequently Egypt at that time. And we basically found poetry and letters and Jewish law. And, one of the things I always think about, right, it's the same story with the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls were found by a shepherd, an Arab shepherd, throwing a rock into a cave. And then all of a sudden he hears a jar shatter and goes in and finds these scrolls from 2,200 years ago. So the question is, how many things like this have not been discovered yet? It's probably, hundreds. And so it's always a little bit of guesswork, if you ask the archaeologists or historians. So can I prove to you that, David existed? No. Do I think he did and that these stories are representative of major historical events? Yeah, I do, as do a lot of historians and archaeologists. So I hope that answers a little bit. Henry, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, I might have the city wrong, but the last time I was in Israel, or maybe the time before, I visited Shechem. I think it was Shechem in the West Bank, about 30 or 40 miles north of Jerusalem, and there it's an Orthodox community, and they're convinced that they've got the other temple, and they've got it laid out on the hilltop, and it's pointing in the right direction, and they found archaeological foundations, and I mean, they've got the whole thing worked out.
Yeah, I think you're talking about, so there's so Shlem is a Palestinian village now, but there's Alon Moreh, which is like the hilltop right outside. I mean, these places are on top of each other, but yeah. I've been there also. And truth is, I mean, with Shlem also, and then with Dan in the north also, I mean, right, sort of what I was saying before. Tell Dan here, let me see if I can get a picture of this. And if anyone has to go at 7, again, feel free to head out. I don't want to.
We don't get a negative mark if we leave.
It's true.
I was
Well,
late.
you might fail the pop quiz in a couple weeks. So anyway, this is
It's 10 o'clock on the East Coast.
okay. So I mean, we're officially done. I can just nerd out about archaeology all day because I became quite interested in it when I was in grad school. So this is basically, what they've found and reconstructed. So of course, the actual dark is what they've discovered, and this is sort of the rest is a reconstructed
No.
area. But this is again right in the north, right in the modern day Golan Heights, and then let's see if there's pictures. Right, so this, right, so they found
Yeah,
right, and this is whoops, sorry, still trying to figure out exactly how to use the function here. All right, here, but we get the point. You can Google
Yeah.
Chaldean and images. So yeah, they have unearthed. So these stories have to be. I mean, there was a. I'm going to completely butcher the dates and stuff like that, but there was a school of thought that arose in Europe maybe 70 or 80 years ago that basically tried to argue that nothing in Jewish history is history until the Greek period, and that all of this history was basically made up by Jews during the Second Temple. And, none of it existed historically. And basically that entire school of thought got thrown in the trash because they did archaeological studies and they found the Dead Sea Scrolls and they found, texts. One of the earliest texts we have is the Birkat Kohanim, right? They uncovered an 8th century BCE text that has Birkat Kohanim, right? So again, scholars have no idea. I mean, the discovery of all these things caused a lot of historians to revise their theories by 400 years, right? So if we were all alive, and sitting in this class maybe, 80 years ago in, schools of thought in European Jewish history, they might have told you none of this happened, right? It all started in the 4th century BCE. And now nobody would say that. Now everybody says, now everything 10th century and on is history. Can we ever discover that, earlier stuff? Sure. So anyone who tries to make, from an academic point of view, anybody who attempts to make a hard and fast rule of, I know X happened or I know X didn't happen, it's probably, there's probably some sort of bias there.
okay.
Well, if there aren't any more thoughts, have a wonderful night, everyone. I'll try to send some timeline material and stuff just to fill in the gaps.
Thank you,
And, see
Daniel.
all next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
you.
you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi Daniel. See you this weekend?
I'm going to be out of town this weekend,
Oh, okay. Okay.
but I will see you soon.
See
Good
you.
night, everybody.